Between 1876 and the late 1920s, around 70 old-timers claimed to be the sole survivors of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, amusing journalists and historians with their tales. These stories usually followed three common themes: disguising themselves as Indians by wrapping up in blankets, hiding inside a scooped-out horse or buffalo, or being rescued by a chief's daughter who found them irresistible. However, one man's story stood out as, well, it was true. As the sole survivor of General George Armstrong Custer's renowned last stand at the Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, Frank FInkel rose to prominence in his later years and following his death. Historians debate the accuracy of FInkel's claim. Although he provided details only someone present at Little Bighorn would know, there are inconsistencies in his accounts of the events. Born in Washington County, Ohio in January 1854, Frank FInkel was the third child of German immigrants, Peter and Magdalena FInkel. According to the 1860 U.S. Census, they owned a farm valued at $500, which was about average for that time and place. The census taker transcribed their name as FInkel, thereby completing the transition throughout Frank's lengthy life from the Germanic Finkel to the Americanized Finkel. 6 sons and 1 girl were born to Peter and Magdalena FInkel. Despite speaking German at home and attending public schools, Frank FInkel acquired bilingualism and became a fluent English reader. After Peter FInkel died in 1868, some of the older sons, including Frank, left the farm, which was too small for 6 men to seek work elsewhere. Down on his luck in Chicago in January 1872, Frank FInkel did what many young men did when they were too proud to beg and too dumb to steal. He enlisted in the U.S. Army. Joining the Army in 1872 was often seen as an admission of economic failure for native-born Americans like Frank. Many young men signed up under assumed names, but Frank went a step further. He chose a name that could potentially help him gain prestige and promotions. He further Germanized his name to August FInkel, claiming Berlin, Prussia as his birthplace, and listing his occupation as a clerk. The previous year, Prussia had achieved a significant victory over Louis Napoleon and the new Republic of France. Prussian soldiers were in high demand and Frank took advantage of this. He kept his birth date as January 23rd but increased his age from 18 to 27. He soon found himself regaling the troopers of the 5th and later the 7th Cavalry, including his German-born friend Charles Windolf, with tales of having been an officer in the Prussian army. His impressive height, just over 6 feet, dark hair, gray eyes, and language skills helped him rise to the rank of sergeant within 2 years. By 1876, FInkel was serving with Captain Tom Custer's 7th Cavalry as a second sergeant in C Company. This high-morale unit was full of Custer loyalists, much like their officers in the heavily divided 7th Cavalry. When the soldiers were issued large, floppy Andrews hats that made them look like buccaneers, C Company was one of 5 companies where the men pooled their money to buy more stylish hats from a Chicago retailer. George Custer's rebuke from the designated post trader, who cautioned him about shopping off post, caused controversy. Post traderships were a corrupt monopoly where investors, who often never saw an army post, hired actual traders to deal with soldiers and local Indians, expecting a 50% kickback. Soldiers at frontier posts paid outrageously high prices for everything from whiskey to canned peaches, while supplies meant for the Indians mysteriously disappeared. The one thing the Indians could consistently rely on was a steady supply of 1866 16-shot Henry repeating rifles. These rifles, now considered surplus due to the newer Winchester 1873 model, were still valued at $75 when the Indians received their cash annuities. Meanwhile, government policy kept the Indians hungry and better armed than the troopers sent to monitor them, who were equipped with single-shot Springfields. Many younger men left the agencies and joined the Sitting Bull Sioux after the Sioux refused to sell the Black Hills in 1875, setting off a powder keg of corruption. Army officers referred to these hunkpapas and other alleged hostiles as self-supporters. After getting into trouble in Washington for testifying about the post-trader controversy, George Custer had to use cunning to get back into the fight to get the Sioux back to their agency. One of 3 forces sent against the hostiles was the 7th Cavalry, which included 2nd Sergeant Frank FInkel and Tom Custer's C Company. The unit left Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. George Custer declined 3 Gatling guns, a 3-inch Rodman cannon, and 2 companies of the 2nd Cavalry, his first Civil War outfit, for his column. He had few doubts about his decision, but C Company seemed less confident. Tom Custer was reportedly nervous before the battle, and his second-in-command, Lieutenant H.M. Harrington, had recurring nightmares about being tied to a tree and tortured by Indians. Edwin Bobo, the first sergeant, had purchased a spare. Bought a mail-order pistol in caliber .22 but neglected to bring it. A white man's scalp on a pole was discovered by C Company as they got closer to the Little Bighorn. Irish-born Civil War veteran, FInkel comrade, and admirer of Custer, 3rd Sergeant Jeremiah Finley put the scalp in his saddlebag, maybe thinking he would give it a respectable burial. The men were clearly jittery. Leading the assault to the Little Bighorn was C Company. FInkel struggled to keep up, likely due to his height and weight imposing a heavy burden on his horse. He was the tallest enlisted man in the 7th Cavalry and one of the heaviest. I was riding close to Sergeant FInkel, Sergeant Daniel Knipe recalled in 1924. We were both near Captain Tom Custer. FInkel yelled at me, saying his horse was going out and he was unable to keep up. I replied, "Come on, FInkel, if you can." He fell back a bit. If Sergeant FInkel hadn't dropped back, he would have gotten the orders to bring up the ammunition pack train, and I wouldn't be telling this story. The second-to-last man to see the Custer brothers alive, Sergeant Knipe, was ordered to return quickly with the pack mules and their 24,000 rounds of Springfield ammo, leaving his companion FInkel and his struggling horse to pursue the Custer brothers all the way to the river. At least 4 C Company troopers dropped out due to horse troubles, 2 with blown horses and 2 possibly from cowardice. But Sergeant FInkel remained with C Company when they reached the stream. George Custer halted at the river and repositioned into 3 defensive spots. C Company, which included Sergeant FInkel and Tom Custer, took up position atop what would become Calhoun Hill, which overlooked the settlement of Hunkpapa. The Indians, who had been sleeping off an all-night courtship dance, were roused by 2 inexperienced troopers who had ridden into the village and began shooting until they were unhorsed and killed. Meanwhile, Major Marcus Reno attacked the enormous encampment from the other side. Warriors armed with repeating rifles, sold to them by post traders, erupted from their teepees. The 7th Cavalry found themselves outgunned 10-1 by the very Indians they had planned to encircle. FInkel later recounted to reporters that the men were ordered to mount their horses. As he was firing, an Indian bullet hit the butt of his Springfield carbine, causing the steel barrel to slam into his forehead. He was struck twice more, once in the leg and once in the side. Additionally, a bullet severed his horse's bridle, and another grazed his horse's flank. Bolting into the oncoming Indians along with the remaining C Company men who hadn't been killed or unhorsed, FInkel was swept through the furious warriors charging uphill to protect their families. He was taken out across the plains, down the hill, and past the Hunkpapa camp at the base of Calhoun Hill. One long sword escaped, Rain in the Face told W. Kent Thomas in 1894. Our huts at the base of Calhoun Hill were passed by his pony as it galloped off with him. I remembered hearing the squaws talk about it after the fight. Not merely FInkel was able to escape the Indians for a short while. Although a skeleton found miles away from Calhoun Hill years later may be Lieutenant Harrington's, his corpse was never found. 3 young Indians with just bows pursued Corporal John Foley of C Company for miles after he broke past the cordon. When Foley realized the lads were out of arrows, he panicked and used his own Colt to shoot himself in the head. As many as 8 men from C Company might have escaped through the Indians, only to be ridden down and killed far from the battlefield. Pro-Custer Crow Indians found 6 skeletons with 7th Cavalry equipment years later, but the Army never bothered to investigate. Trooper Nathan Short traveled over 20 miles to reach the Rosebud River before collapsing and dying along with his horse. Sergeant Finley had been dismounted and was now probably dead or seriously injured, back inside the circle of death and desperation. While other, less brave men panicked and made desperate attempts to flee or, as the Indians said, shot themselves, First Sergeant Bobo, his horse dead, marched resolutely back toward Custer Hill for the last stand. Bobo died in the so-called Keogh sector. Tom Custer perished alongside his brothers George and Boston, his nephew Audie Reed, and their brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun. Meanwhile, FInkel kept riding, dazed and in pain, on his frantic sorrel. He traversed Tulloch Creek's 3 branches during the course of the following day and night. Later, he reported, accurately based on Dr. Charles Kuhlman's geography from the 20th century, that the northernmost branch was fresh and sweet, while the 2 southern branches were contaminated with alkali. FInkel arrived at the Yellowstone and Rosebud River Junction a few days after the calamity. He took 1 pistol shot to the head to end the suffering of his dying horse. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey of the 7th Cavalry recognized there had been a survivor when he found the horse in August. Godfrey recorded the death of a 7th Cavalry horse in 1892, but remarkably, he did not disclose that the horse was a sorrel or light bay from C Company until 1921, in a report that was not made public until the 1950s. The last 4 companies of the 7th Cavalry, distinguished by their color, mounted gray or dark bay horses and rode them all the way to the river. When Sergeant Canape returned to the battlefield, he saw Carlo, Finley's horse, and discovered Finley's body with 12 arrows in it. I passed over the corpses and noticed here and there a comrade and a sergeant that I recognized, he remembered. Sergeants FInkel and Finley were familiar to me. As Sergeant Finley lay at the head of his horse, 12 arrows struck him. They had lain there, mutilated and bleeding in the sun for 2 days. The squaws would always shoot the men with tomahawks or slit their faces with arrows after removing their garments. Although Kneep claimed to have seen FInkel, he never located FInkel's horse, and he never offered a convincing explanation for how he could have recognized a slaughtered corpse after 2 days of temperatures above 100 degrees. FInkel's closest buddy and Reno Hill battle survivor Sergeant Charles Windolph returned to the scene of carnage specifically to locate FInkel's body, but he reported not being able to locate it. FInkel saw a white man cutting wood outside a shack in the middle of unknown area while meandering in the forest. The man was startled at the sight of FInkel's uniform and initially ordered him away at gunpoint. The man gave in and assisted FInkel in standing up after he fell. Another white man was lying on a makeshift bed inside the shanty, obviously dying of tuberculosis, his face pale and haggard. The 2 men, the healthier one known only as Bill, took turns nursing FInkel. FInkel passed out as they applied hot pitch to the wound in his leg after probing it with a pine splinter. FInkel discovered that the gash on his side, which had been bandaged with bear grease, had closed, and that the bleeding had finally ceased. Over the next few weeks, Bill took care of FInkel, and FInkel assisted Bill in caring for his dying friend. When the man passed away, FInkel and Bill buried him with only a plain headstone. Then they parted ways. The men had told FInkel they were trappers, but it was more likely they were gun runners or whiskey traders. FInkel later noted that he never saw any traps at the cabin. Perhaps wary of his status as a deserter following Custer's 1867 command to shoot certain deserters, which led to his own court-martial conviction and a year-long suspension, FInkel discovered that his whole company had been decimated at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Bismarck Tribune's top page included his name 4th from the bottom. Officially declared dead, he may have decided he'd had enough of the army. He later told his second wife that he attempted to claim a discharge but couldn't prove he'd been a soldier without 2 witnesses. This explanation seems like a cover-up for the fact that his successful escape could also be seen as desertion in the face of the enemy. He spent about a year in St. Louis working in the dairy business, then visited California before discovering Dayton, Washington. With limited funds and skills in carpentry and farming, FInkel speculated in land, building successful farms. He sold some of these farms and bought more vacant land. Near his birthday in 1886, he wed Delia Rainwater, the daughter of one of Dayton's most successful farmers and civic leaders, Jacob Rainwater. FInkel signed the marriage certificate as FInkel, but the marriage license is FInkel. On his wedding night, Delia asked about the old gunshot wound on his left side. He told her he'd been shot in a fight with some Indians, without mentioning where the fight occurred. Eventually, the bullet worked its way to the surface, and Frank had a surgeon remove it. FInkel kept purchasing and selling farms during the 1890s, gradually changing his signature name from FInkel to FInkel. The lot numbers and Delia's name confirm it was the same person. 3 of Frank and Delia's 4 children had grown up by 1920, one of them being Ben, who held multiple terms in the Idaho legislature. They were well-respected and rather well-off Dayton residents. During a game of horseshoes in April 1920, maybe after a few beers, Frank somewhat suddenly disclosed that he was a survivor of the Custer massacre. Frank disclosed this after overhearing a fellow farmer describe how the impoverished Custer was caught off guard by Native Americans. Frank responded brusquely, "You don't know what you're talking about." "How do you know so much about it?" his neighbor retorted. "Because I was there." Frank was then invited to talk at the Dayton Kiwanis Club about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Frank consented when his neighbors employed a relief carpenter to complete a porch he was working on. His story was published in the April 8th issue of the local newspaper. Nobody who knew him doubted he'd been there. The journalist didn't fully understand when FInkel used the term skedaddled and wrote Kettler, but the Civil War slang for a panicked retreat marked FInkel as a veteran of the old army. But FInkel told one more bogus tale that tainted the account he told for posterity. Frank joined the army in 1872, 1 year after the Franco-Prussian War. He lived and worked in Dayton during the late 19th century, a popular minority in America made up of hard-working, music-loving Germans. World War I changed all that, and by 1920, Germans were blamed for everything from German measles to the influenza epidemic. FInkel initially claimed his name was on the roster and mentioned it without hesitation when his story first broke. He also stated that he had papers lost in a house fire which provided further confirmation. Later, when someone discovered August FInkel on the casualty list, FInkel's second wife seemed to deny he had ever been August FInkel, whose fake birthplace was listed as Berlin, Prussia. She claimed he had enrolled under the name Frank Hall when she attempted to collect the pension he was eligible for. A guy 14 years older than FInkel, Frank Hall stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with brown eyes and had deserted from the 7th Cavalry a year before to the battle in May 1875. On June 25, 1921, the 45th anniversary of the battle was commemorated with ceremonies, and the newspapers spoke to Frank FInkel again. FInkel told one reporter, "The battle began with an attack on an Indian village. General Custer led one group of troops while Major Marcus Reno commanded another. Custer's forces charged forward until suddenly the air filled with the thunder of yells as Indians sprang from behind every bush and poured over the hilltops. Men and horses fell all around me. A bullet struck my rifle stock, sending a splinter of steel into my forehead, causing blood to flow between my eyes. My horse bolted, carrying me, half-blinded, through the Indian lines. A stinging sensation in my shoulder hit me, and I lost consciousness, falling forward onto my horse. When I regained consciousness, it was dark. By early morning, I had reached the mountains. For 5 days I rode, surviving on raw rabbits, fearing that building a fire would attract the Indians. On the 6th day, I encountered some trappers and stayed with them until September. Delia FInkel passed away in August 1921 after a brief illness. One obituary blandly noted that her husband, who survived her, was the only soldier to escape the Custer massacre. Frank FInkel's signature on the probate for Delia's will, written 49 years after he enlisted in the Army in Chicago, matched the handwriting on his enlistment form. One of Frank and Delia's 2 surviving sons, Ben FInkel, was involved in state politics and had already relocated to Idaho. This might have been another good reason to keep Berlin, Prussia out of the public records. In 1926, Frank FInkel married his second wife, Hermie, an Anglo-Saxon born in Canada who adored him and knew about his status as a Custer survivor, though she was unfamiliar with the old army or the Indians. In August 1930, Frank himself, affluent and pension-free, died at the age of 76. After his death, Hermie remarried and became Hermie Billmeyer, the wife of a struggling grocer in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. With the onset of the Depression, Hermie needed that pension, and perhaps also the recognition of being the widow of the only Custer survivor. She contacted every government official and Custer historian in the United States for the next 20 years, until her own death in 1951, in an effort to establish a status that Frank and his Dayton neighbors had taken for granted. Unfortunately, Hermie was committed to the story that Frank had enlisted under the name of Frank Hall, and somehow got the idea that he had enlisted at Council Bluffs, Iowa, in 1874, serving as a private and acting corporal. She had a tendency to mix things up. 12 years after Frank's death, one of the last newspaper stories he wrote claimed, untrue to Frank himself, that he had shot an Indian who had come to investigate the night after the Little Bighorn and then pretended to be dead. Hermie, for all his honesty, would not acknowledge that FInkel and FInkel were the same person, even though Hermie's own memories of Frank, as well as the enlistment form from Chicago with the name FInkel, both confirmed that Frank was the tallest enlisted man in the 7th Cavalry, standing just over 6 feet tall, with light eyes and dark hair. She appeared more nervous about Berlin, Prussia, than he had been, as evidenced by his apparent willingness to mention his birthplace on the 1876 casualty list before their son Ben entered politics in Idaho. Hermie also seemed to harbor jealousy toward Frank's late wife Delia, who was clearly the love of his life. Hermie asserted that Delia was unaware of Frank's military experience, even though her obituary stated that she had witnessed Frank's gunshot wound as a young bride and was aware, at least 18 months prior to her passing, that Frank was acknowledged as a Little Bighorn survivor. Hermie did discover that Sergeant Charles Windolph, awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on Reno Hill, remembered FInkel, attempted to locate his body later and couldn't find it, a strong confirmation. Furthermore, detractors of the August FInkel story spread untrue reports that Frank FInkel had turned down a chance to see Windolph following the deaths of Frank Windolph and Hermie in 1950 and 1951. Windolph only learned of FInkel's alleged survival long after Frank had passed and expressed regret at not having the chance to reunite with his old comrade. He was indeed a brave soldier. Hermie likely remained unaware of the dead sorrel horse Godfrey found in August 1876, which was linked to C Company. This was perhaps the only instance I knew of where a man might have escaped the fate of his comrades. Godfrey wrote in a letter not sent until 1921, after FInkel's public disclosure, and not published by E.A. Brennenstuhl until after FInkel, Hermie, and Windolph had passed away. Not one person who identified himself through this episode has ever come forward, despite the fact that I have met others who swear to have fled and heard of many others. Hermie probably never knew that only C Company could have plausibly produced survivors, as the details of C Company's dispersion and escape were not well documented until Richard Allen Fox's groundbreaking study of the Little Bighorn in the 1980s. Something similar had been hinted at by Rain in the Face in his 1894 interview, where he described a lone white survivor fleeing past the Hunkpapa camp at the base of Calhoun Hill before the encirclement closed in. "We were better armed than those with single-shot rifles," Rain in the Face remarked. "The ejector wouldn't clear the empty cartridges, therefore their guns wouldn't fire more than once. It was like slaughtering sheep. Some begged on their knees. We spared none." Rather than drawing from Rain in the Face's account, Hermie attempted to associate FInkel with a white horse in a dubious Indian narrative, overlooking Rain in the Face's credible testimony of FInkel's escape, and even claiming to have seen him later in Chicago. FInkel insisted accurately that his horse was a roan, specifically a C Company sorrel. He demonstrated a thorough knowledge of the terrain, satisfying meticulous topographer Charles Kuhlman, who measured distances with 3 different instruments. FInkel used authentic Old Army slang, bore gunshot wounds, and exhibited a military demeanor, all consistent with a man known to have fought at the Little Bighorn, allegedly buried there but never definitively identified among the fallen. Most significantly, FInkel described the battle not through the romanticized lens of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but as recounted by survivors of the 7th Cavalry like Captain Frederick Benteen and corroborated by Indian perspectives in the 1870s. This view was underscored by Dr. Fox's analysis in the 1980s, which confirmed a chaotic retreat where C Company fragmented and fled, leaving bodies scattered across the landscape and one fugitive. Hermie FInkel may have misled those who sought to trace Frank's path through her manipulative name game, but Frank FInkel truly was a survivor of Custer's last stand. The world at the time, which justified expansion, turned a blind eye to corruption, celebrated Custer, and vilified the Indians, was not prepared for such a narrative.